Good morning, or depending on when listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so today we're going to look at another top 10 list. However, this time we're going to be talking with certainty, and we're going to be having a little bit of a history lesson. Every time a new set comes out, ladies and gentlemen, I have made it my point to bring you a top 10 list of the 10 best cards from that set. But it got me thinking, we have old sets which have been released, been used in competitive play for a few years and then rotated out so that they are no longer legal in tournament play, and for those sets we can say with some certainty which the best 10 cards actually were, which I think is pretty gosh darn exciting. So we're going to start from Heartgold Soulsilver, and today we're going to look at the actual 10 best cards from Heartgold Soulsilver. Now this was a fairly decent set and there were some decent cards. So for instance, I know that there are some people out there that were a big fan of Sunflora. Sunflora's kind of cool and it had a fun ability allowing you to search your deck for a grass Pokemon, and this could be used with a particular grass Pokemon which is coming up later on in this list. But it wasn't particularly amazing, it didn't set the format on fire, and it ain't making the top 10 list. Another card which we are going to not be using in this list is Pokemon Reversal. Now this one might be slightly controversial. It's essentially Pokemon Catcher as it is now. Flip a coin, if heads you get to bring one of your opponent's benched Pokemon active. And there was a very short period of time where for US Nationals and for Worlds the format was Heartgold Soulsilver on, but Pokemon Catcher, back before it needed a coin flip, had not yet been revealed. And for that period of time there was a situation where everybody played Pokemon Reversal, and many games just came down to who could flip heads on Pokemon Reversal and who couldn't. This one doesn't make the list for two reasons. First of all, those games were stupid and we all want to forget about that. And second of all, for the vast majority of its life, it wasn't even a good card. Coming before this, we had cards like Luxray Level X, which did the same thing but far better when you evolved Luxray GL into Luxray Level X. And shortly afterwards, we had Pokemon Catcher. The effect of this was so short-lived, I don't think it warrants being put in the top 10 list. And if you disagree, ladies and gentlemen, of course, that's what the comments are for. So coming in at number 10, we have Blissey Prime, quite possibly one of the funnest support Pokemon we've ever had. In short, this ability was a max potion on all of your damaged Pokemon. You got to heal all of your damaged Pokemon, but the downside of healing all of your damaged Pokemon was that you had to get all the damage off of them, and then you had to get all the energy off of them. Now, there were two reasons this was really good. Firstly, there were Pokemon like Donphan Prime, who attacked for 1 energy, so you could easily heal this and then discard the energy, and it really wasn't that bad a problem. But there were other reasons. For instance, later on in the Black and White set, we got Reuniclus, and this was used by Ross Cawthorn in his second place Worlds deck, and the theory was we're going to use Reuniclus to rearrange all of the damage counters on our Pokemon to Pokemon that have no energy on them, and then we can drop Blissey Prime and heal all of our Pokemon at once. The fact that this was an integral part of the deck that made it all the way to second place at Worlds, and quite frankly probably would have won Worlds if it was an untimed game, and that it was a useful tech that was used in decks for pretty much as long as it was legal, gives it its rightful place at number 10. And if I remember, I'll put a link in the description to a video where you can see this Blissey Prime deck working quite nicely indeed. In at number 9, we have one of my favourite Pokemon cards ever, and if this was just a personal list, ladies and gentlemen, it would be number 1 and it wouldn't even be close. Donphan Prime, the card with which I made top 16 at UK Nationals, to date my only top cut appearance at UK Nationals, and I actually wrote quite a lengthy article about this card back in the day, so I shall put a link to that written article in the comments so you can go and have a read of that if you wish. It explains loads about it. Nice and quickly, this was an amazing Pokemon. 120 HP at the time was pretty gosh darn good, but it was the ability and the attacks that really made it sing. The Poké Body, back in the day, passive abilities, ones that just happened were Poké Bodies, and active abilities that you had to choose to use were known as Poké Powers. Nowadays, they've been taken under the umbrella term of abilities. And Donphan's Pokébody reduced all damage done to him by 20. So you've got 120 HP Pokemon, which at the time was very, very good, and you're reducing all damage done to it by 20, and for 1 energy, you do 60 damage. Now you have to do 10 to all of your bench, but, you know, this was not that big a downside when the deck was played correctly. Now, 60 for 1 energy was very, very good back then, especially when the big Pokemon like Donphan had 120 HP. There was no 180 HP EX and all of that. At that stage, we were looking at really 120 was big HP. But it got better because you could use Expert Belt, which meant that you had 20 more HP and all of your attacks did 20 more damage, but you gave up 2 prizes. And there was Broken Time Space, which allowed you to evolve Phanpy into Donphan as soon as you liked on turn 1 of the game, and back then you could even use Rare Candy to evolve into a Stage 1. So let me wrap that all up for you, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a Stage 1 Pokemon that you can evolve on turn 1, and for 1 energy he's doing 80 damage on a 140 HP Pokemon that reduces all damage done to it by 20 in a format where 120 HP was very, very good. It was absolutely monstrous, and it was fast, and it was hard-hitting, and that's why it comes in at number 9. Coming in at number 8, a card which will take a lot less explanation, Pokemon Communication. Now this has been reprinted since. It allows you to take a card, a Pokemon card, in your hand and swap it for another Pokemon card in your deck. It's nothing particularly fancy, but back then we were using an awful lot of Pokemon Draw like Claydol and Uxie. Supporter Draw was a lot less big of a thing than it is nowadays, so decks generally played more Pokemon, and getting those Pokemon like Uxie and Claydol out were very, very important. This card at the time gave a consistency boost which was really quite hard to beat. Coming in at number 7, another card which has been reprinted since and doesn't take as much explanation is Copycat. You get to shuffle your hand into your deck and draw as many cards as your opponent has. Now, it's not amazing, although if your opponent had a big hand, obviously it becomes amazing. But, like I say, back then, supporter draw was not such a big thing. We would only play 1 or 2, you know, and it really, I mean, some cards, it depended what deck you were playing. Obviously, some played more than that, but some decks could, you know, in terms of shuffle draw, just play a couple. And Copycat really was a very good card. But, let's say you need more than that, how about Yanmega Prime? Now, this came out a couple of sets after Heartgold Soulsilver, but Yanmega Prime had a good Pokébody, which allowed you to attack for free if you could match hand sizes with your opponent. And this was played, and it really was at the heart of, you know, Stage 1 decks with cards like Donphan Prime, as well as being big with cards like Magnezone Prime. So quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, this allowed a card like Yanmega, and I don't want to spoil anything, but when I get to the appropriate set, Yanmega Prime will be making the top 10. Actually, I can't say that for certainty, I haven't looked, but I'd be surprised if there were 10 better cards. Honourable mention at best. I'm sure it'll be in the top 10. And the fact that its general utility as Shuffle Draw really did make it worthy of coming in at number 7. Now, coming in at number 6, I'm cheating just a little bit, and I hope you can forgive me for that. We have baby Pokemon. Let's start off with Cleffa. Now, all of these baby Pokemon were, as you might expect, baby Pokemon. The pre-evolutions that came around in the Gold and Silver games. And they all had 30 HP, and they all had a... Well, these are attacks we don't get anymore, but they actually had free attacks. That weird little hole means that you can attack for free. And all of them did something, and then you went to sleep. However, they all had the same Pokébody, which meant that they couldn't be damaged by attacks as long as they were asleep. So yes, they're really, 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 really weak, but you did something useful, you went to sleep, and if you didn't wake up, you were absolutely immune. Cleffa allowed you to shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 6 cards. This was in the days when most people were playing Claydol, a stage 1, and when you're using a stage 1 to help you set up, we are talking about decks which are a little bit slower than we used to sometimes nowadays. And Cleffa saw an awful lot of play because it gave consistency like almost nothing else. And if you were able to stay asleep at the end of your turn, you didn't even give up a prize for doing so. It was, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, a really, really useful card. But then these other baby Pokemon all came around in the same set as well. For instance, we had Tyrogue. Now, Tyrogue was a very popular counter to Cleffa because the thing that he did for 0 energy was 30 damage. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. And it wasn't affected by weakness or resistance. And this was on the days where you could attack going first. Obviously, nowadays, as I speak here in 2016, you cannot attack if you go first. That was not the rule back then. So there would be many a game decided because one person would start Cleffa and the other person would start Tyrogue and go first. So all they would have to do was Mischievous Punch and they would win the game. And let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that Mischievous Punch is an attack for 0 damage, and that means that you didn't even need to find an energy in order to do the attack. Now, the other big card, as in the other one of the babies that really saw quite a lot of play, was Pichu. And Pichu was incredibly useful. It let both players search your deck for as many basic Pokemon as you like and put them onto your bench. Now, this was quite interesting because, first of all, it let decks like the Truth deck that Ross Cawthorne played at Worlds that I mentioned when I talked about Blissey Prime, it allowed decks like that to set up much, much faster. But it also allowed your opponent to do so. So any big setup deck that needed a lot of basics early would play Pichu to guarantee that you could get them all out nice and quickly. But of course, if your opponent did this, then they would have those basics on their bench at the start of their turn, meaning they were ready to be evolved, which did create an interesting dynamic in that in some games, when you saw what your opponent was playing, Pichu would not be able to be used. Now, there were a couple of others that are nowhere near as good. Igglybuff, well, actually, he just put himself to sleep, and that was about it. It really wasn't particularly good, I'm afraid. It didn't just put itself to sleep. It put itself to sleep, and then your opponent's attack cost was 1 higher. It really wasn't a very useful card. It saw very, very little play. One that saw a tiny bit more play, but really not that much, was Smoochum. It allowed you to move an energy card attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon to another. So you would take something like a double colorless energy, something very, very useful, and put it on, as a lot of decks were playing back then, you would put it on a Claydol where it would be entirely useless. Not an amazing card, but Smoochum saw a bit of play. Really, it was the big three of Cleffa, Pichu, and to counter them, Tyrogue, that saw a lot of play. And that is why the baby Pokemon, possibly meanly of me, because I think you could easily argue these higher, but for me, they come in at number 6. Now, honestly, ladies and gentlemen, given the amount of testing we've all been able to do with these cards, the amount of tournaments, I feel very confident in my top 10 list. I think these are the 10 best cards in Heartgold Soulsilver. But from 6 upwards, you really could make an argument, except for number 1. I think number 1 is absolutely set. But outside of number 1, I think 2 to 6, you really could jumble around however you like, and I wouldn't be able to argue too much. But in at number 5 comes a card that if you weren't playing at the time, you might not have realised what all the fuss was about: double colourless energy. And the reason why double colourless energy was so good was Garchomp C Level X. Garchomp C Level X had an attack called Dragon Rush. For free energy, free colourless energy, you got to do 80 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. And you would discard 2 energy in order to do that. Now, that might not seem particularly good. At the time, most Pokemon had about 80 damage, 80 HP or less, including, things like Garchomp C himself had 80 damage, 80 HP. Luxray, which a lot of people were playing, had, I believe, 80 HP. And then you had things like Uxie that had, 80 HP or less. Uxie actually had 70 HP, but a lot of the Pokemon had 80 or less. So you could essentially go around and just snipe whatever Pokemon you wanted off your opponent's bench. And you could just run your opponent out of anything useful and just do this turn after turn until you went ahead and won the game. Here was the problem. When this card came out in Supreme Victors, having to discard those 2 energy was a little bit too much. You just couldn't discard those 2 energy turn after turn, so Garchomp C Level X wasn't seeing a lot of play. Now, Double Colorless Energy was released in the base set, the very first ever set of Pokemon cards, and it wasn't re-released until Heartgold Soulsilver. As soon as it was released, Garchomp C Level X became the best card in the format, or at the very least, the best attacker in the format. And these SP decks that were built around cards like Garchomp C Level X and Luxray GL Level X and Dialga G Level X, these decks really dominated the format for years. They were absolutely amazing. And Garchomp C Level X was the best attacker of all of them. And it was purely because of Dragon Rush, and it was purely because of Double Colorless Energy. Now, since Heartgold Soulsilver, Double Colorless Energy has never not been in the format. It has been a staple in our format ever since Heartgold Soulsilver was released. But back then, it was making a comeback after a very long absence, and it transformed the game. Think of how many decks, even recent decks, things like Raichu and Vespiquen, that are really now good because of Double Colorless Energy. But back then, it was all about Garchomp C Level X, and it became the best attacker in the format when Double Colorless Energy was reprinted. If you weren't around, let me assure you, it was a very, very big deal, and that's why, although you could argue it higher, it comes in at number 5. Coming in at number 4, we have Professor Oak's New Theory. And this is another card which might not seem amazing, but I assure you it was. There were times when it was played in every single deck. It's basic shuffle draw. Shuffle your deck into your hand, your hand into your deck, and draw 6 cards. Might not sound particularly amazing. It was consistent. Copycat, as we've already seen, was good, but it didn't necessarily do too well because your opponent could have had a hand of 2 or 3 cards. Professor Oak was consistent and it was reliable. It was just plain good. It was a staple in almost every deck through a few formats, and that's why it comes in at number 4. In at number 3, we have Jumpluff, and Jumpluff is a weird card which really demonstrates power creep. Power creep being the idea that Pokemon cards are becoming more powerful over time. Now, it had an attack for 1 grass energy, mass attack. Does 10 damage times all the number of Pokemon in play. Might not sound particularly good. Heck, it's the same attack as Empoleon from Dark Explorers, and that was a bit of a niche card that some people played. It wasn't amazing like Jumpluff. What made Jumpluff so good? It was in a format where the good Pokemon generally had 120 HP or less, which means if everybody on the field, if the field was full, it would one-hit KO anything. And let's not forget we had Expert Bout then, so you could do that extra 20 damage if you wanted to. And it was fast. Broken Time Space was in the format, which means that you could evolve up on turn 1 and attack. And Rare Candy was in the format, and you could use Rare Candy when the Pokemon hadn't been down for a turn. Which more on that when we get to other sets. So on turn 1, you could often get a Jumpluff out, hitting for, your opponent had to have at least 1 Pokemon on the field, so you were hitting at least 70 on turn 1. It was phenomenal, ladies and gentlemen, and heck, with an Expert Bout, you could be hitting 90 on turn 1. It only had 90 HP, and it went down pretty easily, but oh my goodness, it was fast and it hit hard, and tournament after tournament after tournament was won by Jumpluff coming out quickly and smashing you in the face. I remember a particular Nationals, my very first ever Nationals, where I went 4-3, and my 3 losses were Jumpluff, Jumpluff, Jumpluff. In fact, 4 of my 7 games at that tournament were against Jumpluff. That's how good it was. The only deck better than Jumpluff, in fact, were the SP decks, and that's why it comes in at number 3. Now, coming in at number 2, and like I've said, from 2 to 6, I really think you could shuffle this whole order around. The order is my personal opinion. Now, as far as I'm concerned, 2 to 6 is correct. I was playing through the entire formats from when Heartgold Soulsilver was released through to when it rotated, and I am utterly convinced that these are the 2nd to 6th best cards. However, the order could be mucked around. But at number 2, I'm putting Typhlosion Prime. And the reason is we had Worlds formats where Typhlosion Prime was just plain amazing. It really was absolutely brilliant. It had the poker power. Remember back then, active abilities, ones that you had to choose to use, were poker powers. And it allowed you to put a fire energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon, and if you do, put a damage counter on that Pokemon. Now, nowadays we see this with cards like Bronzong, for instance, and it's not that amazing, but back then it really, really was. Energy acceleration was less prevalent back then, at least at times, and this really allowed you to hit hard, and it really allowed you to hit quite fast as well. Now, Typhlosion himself wasn't an amazing attacker, but for instance, when Black and White came out, Reshiram really took advantage of Typhlosion and became amazing, although that was far from the only deck where it was used. I'm not saying Typhlosion Prime was the best attacker, and I'm not saying that he was for a period of time the best ever, but whereas cards like Jumpluff were not amazing for their whole time, they did go out of style after a little while, Typhlosion really was amazing for its entire run from Heartgold Soulsilver onwards, and as far as I'm concerned, that makes it good enough to put it at number 2. Now, in at number 1, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm going to invite you to argue in the comments as I always do, but as far as I'm concerned, ladies and gentlemen, number 1 is number 1 and there is no argument. There are very few cards from these old sets that if they came out nowadays, they would instantly become a staple in every set. But this is one of them, and that is Pokémon Collector. Every deck would play this. It is amazing. Pokémon Collector allowed you to search for any free basic Pokémon, and they went to your hand, not the bench, which means you could search for a couple of Pokémon and an Uxie. Uxie being very much like Shaymin EX nowadays, except it allowed you to draw to 7 cards, not to 6. So you could use your supporter for the turn, draw a couple of cards, and then you could go for an Uxie, or indeed 1 Pokemon and 2 Uxie. It really was an amazing card, and it was one of the reasons why Shuffle Draw wasn't that big back then, because on the early turns, everybody just wanted to play a Pokemon Collector because it would get you whatever you wanted. Everybody was playing Uxie, so you would just get Uxies and use that to set up. Maybe you'd get a Baltoy to evolve into a Claydol the following turn. It would get you whatever you want. Nowadays, we have 2 versions of this, neither of which is good enough. We have Bridget, which is worse in 2 ways, because it's 1 EX or 3 regular Pokemon. But the card we use to set up nowadays is Shaymin, so you can't get 2 little Pokemon and a Shaymin, like you could get 2 little Pokemon and an Uxie with Pokemon Collector. And they go straight onto your bench, so you can't grab these cards and then put them down and use their abilities. We've got Hooper EX, which is a similar kind of thing, except it's a Pokemon. You've got to leave it on your bench so it takes up a bench space. And it gives up prizes if it gets KO'd. And you can only go for free EXs, not non-EX Pokemon. Pokemon Collector is one of the greatest setup cards we have ever had, and if it came out today, ladies and gentlemen, it would be an instant staple in basically every deck. I really don't think there is any argument that Pokemon Collector is not the very best card in Heartgold Soulsilver. Now, as always, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of you out there that disagree with my list. You know the deal. Put your arguments down in the comments, but as always, please provide a full top 10 list. If you're going to argue with me, it's only fair you put some thought into it and let me argue back. As I've said, I feel very confident in the number 1. I feel very confident in 2 through 6. 6, though I am willing to agree that the order might be willing to be fleshed around, and then from 7 to 10 I feel pretty good. You could argue Pokemon Reversal in, but hopefully I made it clear why I don't think you should. My aim is to do this from basically every Pokemon set over the next couple of months or however long it takes, so if you've got a particular set that you really want me to look at, pop it down in the comments and I shall do my very, very best to accommodate you. I'm going to be back with Unleashed in the not too distant future, which was chronologically the next set afterwards, so look forward to that. Make sure you like, comment and subscribe, and look after yourselves till next we meet. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Ross and you've been watching PTCG Radio.